It all comes down to this. Two undefeated seasons enter, and only one can leave this massive game with their season intact. The Michigan Wolverines, led by J.J. McCarthy, and the Washington Huskies, led by top NFL prospect Michael Penix Jr., shall meet in Houston on Monday to determine who can have a perfect season. How's it going, everybody? I am Jason of Jason's Realm here, and today I will be providing an in-depth breakdown of the college football championship game between the number 1 ranked Michigan Wolverines and the number 2 ranked Washington Huskies. Without further ado, let's just go ahead and break down this critical game. So, let's start off with the underdogs. The Washington Huskies entered this game as a 4.5 point underdog, or at least at the time of recording this, but how did they get here? Well, they obviously went undefeated, but who did they beat? They beat some solid teams, and they got 6 of their 14 wins against AP top 25 ranked teams. Those being 1 against Oregon State, USC, Utah, and Texas, and another 2 against Oregon. They have also won by a combined 40 points in these games, which is not bad, with an average margin of victory of 6 points, just over 6 points per game versus the top teams in the country. Now, let's talk about how they perform. What are the numbers? Well, they're scoring over 37 points per game and getting 473 yards per game on offense, which is pretty good, all things considered. Defensively, they're alright, giving up just over 24 points per game, but giving up just over 400 yards per game, which could come back and bite them versus Michigan. Washington also has another huge problem: the penalties. This team is giving their opponents about 71 yards per game in penalties. Pair this with their defensive stats, and they are giving roughly 1 yard for every yard that they gain, which will lead to a disaster potentially against Michigan. Now, looking at individual players, Washington's offense is loaded. They got one of the top prospects for the 2024 draft at quarterback in Michael Penix Jr., who has a 66.7 completion percentage and has thrown for 4,648 yards for 35 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. In the run game, they are spearheaded by Dylan Johnson, who has 222 attempts for 1,162 yards and 16 touchdowns. The receiving game is also stacked with a solid big three in Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk, and Jalen McMillan, who are all over 500 yards, with Odunze and Polk being each over 1,100 yards on the season. Combined, these players also have 26 touchdowns, so this receiving trio is lethal if they are left to cook. Now let's go ahead and shift gears here to talk about the Michigan Wolverines. The Wolverines are also 14-0 with 4 of their wins coming against AP top 25 ranked teams. They have won these games by a combined 48 points, on average 12 points per win against the top teams in the country. These wins came against Alabama, Penn State, Ohio State, and Iowa. Looking at their stats this season, they are averaging 36 points per game and just over 375 yards per game of offense, while only giving up just over 10 points per game and 240 yards per game on defense. Michigan wins their games by defense, with their offense doing just enough to get the win, just like the ideal situation for the New York Jets in the NFL. Another huge advantage for Michigan in this game is their discipline. Michigan was averaging only 26 penalty yards per game, significantly lower than Washington's 71, and it could lead to a huge swing in yardage for Michigan. Moving on to individual stats, they have a good quarterback who takes care of the ball and could be a top pick in the 2025 NFL draft, because I don't think he declares for the 2024 draft, in J.J. McCarthy. McCarthy has a 73.25 completion percentage and has thrown for 2,851 yards for 22 touchdowns to only 4 interceptions. McCarthy is great at taking care of the ball and limiting the turnovers. Turnovers, by the way, is another area where Michigan is great. Combining all of their quarterbacks' interceptions and their total lost fumbles, this team has only turned the ball over 8 times this season. Now let's go ahead and move on to the running game. The running game is led by the premier back Blake Corum, who has 237 attempts for 1,111 yards and 25 touchdowns, an absolute star on the field for the offense. Michigan is also great at spreading the ball around on offense. You never know where the ball is going to go, as they have no receivers over 1,000 yards, which is to be expected with McCarthy only throwing for 2,800. But anyway, 3 receivers over 500 yards and 6 receivers that are over 200 yards. The receiving game is led by Roman Wilson and Colston Loveland, who have combined for 1,320 yards and 16 touchdowns. A deadly duo indeed. Now that we have looked at these teams, what are my thoughts and takeaways for this game? I think Michigan has a huge advantage in this one. They're the more disciplined team in terms of penalties and ball control. two key aspects in a football game. Michigan this season has turned the ball over once for roughly every 2 Washington turnovers, which is massive, not to mention the massive discrepancy in average penalty yards per game, which could be a swing of about 50 yards per game in favor of Michigan. Moving on to the offense, it is true that Washington has a huge advantage, but I don't know if they'll be able to cook. One other thing Michigan is good at is getting to the quarterback. This season, they have a massive total of 38 sacks for 277 yards lost by the offense. Michael Penix will likely be running for his life the whole game, and he will not have time to throw his specialty, those deep throws that are placed absolutely perfectly for the receiver. That means that Washington could easily struggle to get a lead offensively, as Michigan will play well on defense and will throw the offense of Washington off balance. That being said, I do think Michigan gets this win, and I do take them by a final score of 34-28. I think that the Michigan defense will crack down at the right time to get a huge stop, and Washington will come up empty-handed. I also think that Michigan offense will get into a little bit of a rhythm early on in the game to establish a bit of a lead, which they can just use to kind of steamroll and stay one step ahead of Washington. Well, that's about going to do it for me today. If you did like, don't forget to smash that like button, and if you really enjoyed it, subscribing might just be the decision for you to make. If you're still unsure, then why not go ahead and check out my Week 18 NFL predictions down here. That video will help you make that decision, and with that, I will see you guys later. Peace out and have a good one.